The year 2000 was not the most shocking year in WWE history. It wasn't a year defined by a single moment that changed everything, and it's not always remembered as the greatest. Yet, when we look back at it, there's something unusual. Somehow, almost everything worked. Not perfect, not always logical, but rarely empty. The question is not, what happened in 2000? The real question is, why did it all feel like it worked? The year 2000 was not built on one star. It was built on layers. At the very top, there was the Rock charisma that never felt forced. On the other side, Triple H, an antagonist who wasn't just hated, but believed as a real threat. And, in the background, The Undertaker remained a looming presence that never truly disappeared. But the strength of 2000 didn't stop at the top. Beneath them was Kurt Angle, a newcomer who immediately felt different. Chris Jericho not just entertaining, but reliable in the ring. Chris Benoit and Eddie Guerrero, two technical wrestlers who kept the mid-card from ever feeling like filler. Even the tag division, despite its fluctuations, still had Edge and Christian, the Hardy Boys, and the Dudley Boys. Three teams with clearly defined identities. The meaning was simple. If one star was absent 1 week, the show didn't collapse. The year 2000 did not depend on faces. It depended on structure. Many fans remember the word push as a rocket, a winning streak, a sudden title shot, a surge of cheers. But in 2000, a push rarely looked like acceleration. It looked more like testing. The system almost never said, "We're going to make him a star." More often, it sounded like, "Let's see what happens if we give him exposure." It usually began with a gradual rise. More wins, more television time, slightly stronger opponents. You could see it with Kurt Angle. He arrived with a risky gimmick, an arrogant Olympic gold medalist. He wasn't thrown straight into the world title picture. He was given victories, then tougher opponents, then longer speaking segments on television. Not a rocket, a slow, visible climb. Then came the phase most fans rarely noticed, the test. Not one city, not one night, but week after week. Chris Jericho was a clear example. The reactions were strong. The character was alive. Yet he would win, then lose, then win again. To some fans, it felt inconsistent. To the system, it was a question. Does he remain relevant even when he doesn't always win? Then came the most misunderstood phase, the hold. This is where many fans felt someone was being stopped. Big Show is a clear case. He had the size, the presence, the status. Yet, throughout the year, his position fluctuated, not because he was disliked, but because the system wasn't certain where he was most stable. He wasn't being destroyed. He was being held. And eventually, a decision would come. Advance or redirect. Eddie Guerrero was another telling example. Not always at the top of the card. Not always winning big, but always given room to perform. The system saw durability, not just momentary reactions. In 2000, WWE's strength wasn't how fast they pushed someone, but how often they measured before locking them in. A push was not a promise. A push was an open question in front of the audience. And because those questions were rarely answered too quickly, the roster of 2000 rarely felt fragile. Stories in 2000 were rarely complicated, but the conflicts within them were layered. It wasn't one central feud. It was several forces pulling in different directions at once. At the top, there was a conflict of power. Triple H, The Rock, and the McMahon family represented a struggle between popularity and control. This wasn't just about championships. It was about who defined the rules of the game. But the year 2000 did not stop there. In the tag division, conflict moved differently. Edge and Christian, the Hardy Boys, and the Dudley Boys weren't just fighting to win. They were competing in creativity. Tables, ladders, and chairs were not just props. They became a new language of attention. Meanwhile, the mid-card conflicts felt more personal. Chris Benoit, Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, and Kurt Angle weren't always in the main storyline, but their matches consistently felt meaningful because of quality, not just narrative. There were also conflicts of identity. Kane, constantly suspended between monster and man. The Undertaker, not always at the center. Yet every appearance shifted the tone of the show. This is what made the year 2000 feel alive. Conflict did not move in a single straight line. It moved across multiple layers at once. A conflict of power, a conflict of innovation, a conflict of prestige, a conflict of identity. Audiences weren't following one big story. They were following several stories, filling the space. And as long as that space wasn't empty, each episode had a reason to exist. What made 2000 feel alive wasn't only the conflicts, but how those conflicts grew. Major matches rarely appeared out of nowhere. They were built slowly, through weeks that seemed small, yet connected. Promos were one of the strongest tools. Not just shouting, but motivation explained. A single in-ring segment could completely change the meaning of a match. The audience didn't just know who was fighting. They knew why. And when conflict wasn't driven by words, it was driven by small events, brief interruptions, post-match attacks, victories that felt unfair, moments that seemed minor, but accumulated into emotional reasons. That's why pay-per-views in 2000 rarely felt empty, not because every match was spectacular, but because the audience had followed the journey. When the arena lights dimmed and the opening music played, it wasn't just another monthly event. It was release, and that feeling couldn't be created in one night. It could only be built through consistency. One of the most overlooked aspects of 2000 wasn't the matches. It was the rhythm. Raw felt like weekly drama. Long promos still existed, but rarely crossed into exhaustion. SmackDown felt faster, more action, fewer pauses. Episodes often opened strong, varied in the middle, and closed with a question for the following week. Audiences didn't just watch WWE, they followed a pattern, and that pattern made each episode feel like continuation, not repetition. The year 2000 was certainly not without flaws. The women's division was often treated as a sideshow. Booking could be strange at times. Some characters disappeared without explanation. Yet those shortcomings rarely had a major impact, because the core system kept moving. WWE in 2000 was not a perfect year, nor was it the most revolutionary, but it was a year where many parts supported one another. A layered roster, measured pushes, clear stories, consistent television rhythm. It worked, not because of one explosive moment, but because too many small things did not fall apart at once. The year 2000 was not about spectacle. It was about balance. And within that balance, there was always a highest point. Not only because of popularity, not only because of championships, but because of position within the system. To truly understand how that system worked, it isn't enough to study the year. We have to look at the person sitting at the top, not as a legend, not as a favorite, but as a function within the structure. Because if the year 2000 was a machine, then the next question is no longer, why did the machine run? But who was sitting in the control seat? And in the year 2000, that seat was not empty. It was occupied by one name, Triple H.